And this month, we're coming to you to talk to you about how to begin your journey to a passwordless identity or a passwordless environment, a topic that has garnered a lot of interest this year, particularly with the current situation we are in quarantine and work from home, has really kind of highlighted the importance of having a more robust security posture, especially for a workforce that is now outside of the perimeter, firewall perimeter that we have trusted in for so many years, and really started a conversation around zero trust. And passwordless is definitely part of that zero trust discussion. Just a quick backgrounder. Many of you may be familiar with Oxford Computer Group or OCCG. Just wanted to provide, for those that may not be familiar, who we are, what we do. So we do have a long track record of deploying identity and hybrid identity solutions, primarily started around the what's now known as the Microsoft Identity Manager, formerly known as Forefront Identity Manager or FIM. Prior to that, Identity Lifecycle Manager. It's gone through several iterations over the course of the last 20 years or so. But we also provide services around identity governance with our partnership with Savient and Imprivata in the healthcare space. In addition to providing consulting security and solutions in the security space, everything from privileged access management to security solutions, identity provisioning, deprovisioning, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, and largely on the Microsoft stack, working with the Microsoft M365, E3, and E5 solutions. We have been named Microsoft Identity Partner of the Year several times, 8 times to be exact, and we do have very deep connections with the engineering and product teams at Microsoft. So as to this topic, as I mentioned at the outset, we are in an identity-driven security posture now. That is our world where security really is the control plane. With everybody being remote, really it's not possible to rely wholly on the perimeter, traditional perimeter, as we know, with firewalls and proxies protecting our internal assets and trusting those firewalls and proxies to do the job and trusting that network. But we are relying more on the identity and identity providers, whether you're using Azure AD as your identity provider or Okta or another third-party solution. Really, we come to rely on those solutions to provide a lot of the contextual or conditional access policies that drive access to resources in an environment. But even with all that sophistication now, many companies, us included, we're still securing those identities with passwords. And I often illustrate it with protecting a high-tech bank vault with a very simple mortise and key lock set, since passwords are a very, very old method of securing our assets. How old? Well, passwords have been around as a security, a primary form of security for digital assets for about 60 years. So started sometime in the 1950s at MIT in the old mainframe and time-sharing models. That's where passwords were first implemented. By all accounts, of course, there could be some other sources to that. But by all accounts, that's where the idea of securing assets with a password became prevalent, and we've been using them ever since. And of course, now we see that the costs associated with using passwords as a primary form of authentication just keeps going up. According to the Verizon, the annual report, data breach report that they release, insecure passwords or compromised passwords account for 80% of the breaches that we read about. of which there's a new one seemingly every single day. And it's no surprise then that many agree that passwords have reached the end of their shelf life. Many of the main providers, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Okta, I could rattle off a few other names, all agree that it really is time to kill the password. And it's the reason why organizations like the FIDO Alliance, FIDO, FIDO, which is a consortium of many of these companies, have come together to find a way to move beyond passwords into a more secure authentication model. Now, we know what the problem with passwords are, as I just said, and the problem is that many organizations make it worse because we've adopted policies that make passwords even more of a problem. Now, this is no one's fault in particular. We were just following guidance, and this is actually guidance that came down from NIST, from the National Institute of Standards and Technology many years ago. Actually, about 2002, 18 years ago, was when the first publication was issued as to password guidance. And this guidance was set where we were requiring long passwords, greater than 10 characters, requiring multiple character sets so that complexity was recommended to turn on, and then also requiring that we have users change their passwords at regular intervals, 30, 45, 90 days, etc. But this actually has, and the research shows, it's just made the problem worse. And why is that? Well, for instance, think of the requirement of having a long password, anything over really 8 characters. What happens is that users' behavior becomes predictable and therefore undesirable. When you have those types of password length requirements, users are going to use familiar words and patterns that make it very easy for computers to guess those passwords. The requiring multiple character sets, again, does the same thing, where users are going to recycle passwords like spring 2020 exclamation mark or spring 2020 hashtag, and essentially just change that last special character when it's time to change their password, typically 2 if not 4 times a year that they have to do that. And then that password expiry, again, because of that, just makes it so that users are not coming up with a difficult password. They're just trying to come up with one that meets the requirements, but that is easy to guess. And that's why I always like to use this cartoon from KXCD, who basically kind of put it into an easy way to understand that these password complexities rules that we've established and enforced, while they may make it easy for humans to remember that password, it's pretty easy for a computer to guess, right? So the thought being there that instead try to educate users to instead use passphrases. So for instance, in the cartoon here, using this correct horse battery staple, because those are 4 words with enough entropy that it would be more difficult for a computer to guess. And that is true. It is much more desirable to use a passphrase like this versus, as you see in the first panel, the word troubadour, &3, because that could be difficult for a user to remember. And if they can't remember it, then they're calling the help desk to help them reset their password, or having to do that through a self-service password reset portal, which is undesirable. It's just a bad user experience. But even though passphrases are better, easy to remember, are they necessarily any better? Yeah, but of course, there are some issues still associated with that. This is a study from Carnegie Mellon University where they took over almost 1,500 participants and did a study on the usability of system-assigned passphrases and system-assigned passwords. So these are being generated by the system, and what they found was that instead of trying to commit them to memory, what users would do at that point is write those passwords down, store them in an unsecure manner, and perhaps if you peruse your your users and their files, you may find files called passwords, where they're keeping passwords for various things right there on their desktop, or in a shared account or online account. Something that I just recently saw with a client, where they had a spreadsheet with passwords that got compromised, and the file was, of course, called passwords, because if they name it anything else, they'll forget where it is, right? So these are some of the issues that we all know are associated with just keeping passwords in an environment, and how they continue to make us insecure. And at the end of the day, it's interesting that passwords really don't matter. And this is a phrase taken from Microsoft principal program manager Alex Weinert. He's in their security team. They did a study last summer, July 2019. They published it, where they show that your password and the complexity rules dictating their composition really don't matter. And here's why. This is just two examples from this list. And I have the source there on the bottom, but if you go out and just search for your password doesn't matter, Alex Weinert, you'll find this tech community blog at techcommunity.microsoft.com. But just two examples of the most frequent types of attacks that Microsoft in particular is seeing out there: credential stuffing and phishing. So credential stuffing, which is just an effort to take stolen credentials, or I should say found credentials on these dumps that are all over the dark web, and just trying various combinations of those credentials and passwords, and trying them against a resource. All right, so an Azure AD tenant as an example, with a bunch of names, and just trying to see which ones stick. And because users are still using either weak passwords or combination of weak passwords and reused passwords, as the statistic says there under users continue to admit reuse of a password, 62% are still reusing passwords. It becomes pretty easy. And at that point, did the password complexity rules really matter? Well, no, because the attacker has the exact password. It's either been found on a dump somewhere, and because of that, they're just able to replay that, use those in these credential stuffing attacks. In a phishing attack, which sure we're all seeing often and daily, high incidence of phishing attacks, and that's the frequency. About 0.5% of all inbound emails in an environment are phishing emails. Does the password matter in that case? Well, no. It's because the user got phished and they gave up the password. And so having these complexity rules isn't really helping anything if, number one, passwords are being reused and being found on the dark web and can be used in these credential stuffing attack or in a phishing attack where the user is giving up the password. No, it really doesn't. So really, it just speaks to the fact that it's time to move beyond passwords and adopt new paradigm for how we're authenticating to resources. So how do we do that? How do we begin your passwordless journey? Well, first and foremost, the only thing on this slide is enable and enforce MFA. Enabling MFA in your environment is going to cut down, and this is not just one of those made up statistics, but it's 99% of these types of attacks will be thwarted if MFA is enabled. Now, the type of MFA that you adopt is important. So our advice that we're giving to customers is, number one, do not use SMS text message as a second factor of authentication. Reason for that is SIM swapping is still a thing. In fact, the Twitter attack from a couple weeks ago, where that 17-year-old from Florida, plus a couple of other cohorts, were able to social engineer some Twitter employees, and then also there was they believe there was some SIM swapping methods used to take over some of these accounts. They're able to do that because SMS is still being used as a second factor of authentication. So please, if you can, in your environments, do not allow SMS as a second factor. utilize an app such as the Microsoft Authenticator app, either as your primary form of authentication, which is known as a passwordless sign-in, which can be done in Azure AD on iPhone and on Android platforms, or at least as a second factor where you're using a push notification functionality for that. So that'd be the first and foremost thing you can do to help secure your environment. And since we're talking about a journey, right, where we know that going to a passwordless environment is not something you can just switch on overnight and expect to start, be using, have a passwordless environment in place. But these are the steps to get you there, right? So the first thing you want to do is just harden your environment and enable and enforce MFA wherever and whenever you can. The second thing, or a few things more, is really start looking into adopting the new password guidance. So we talked about NIST password guidance back from 2002, which trickled down to the private sector, and the private sector started to use it. Well, 2 years ago, in a new publication, they've realized that that was a mistake. So the NIST publication is 863-3. And in that publication, they realized over the past 16 years or so of research that the old advice was really making things worse. So they've come up with new guidance around passwords, and we're seeing some good results from customers adopting this. And one of the first thing is you want to favor the user. You choose password policies that are user friendly and that put the burden on the verifier where possible, meaning you don't want to burden the user with having to come up with these complex password requirements where they're going to just be predictable and undesirable, as mentioned before, coming up with the same patterns for their passwords every time, but really make it so that the verifier has to do some work, whether that's MFA, whether that's some other authentication method that's going to, again, put that burden on that verifier. You want to eliminate that security theater, right? So stop asking users to do things that are not actually improving security and could be making things worse, such as password rotation, right? Instead, adopt a scenario or an environment where the user only has to change their password if they've been compromised or if there's indication of a compromise. And that's if you're using tools, if you are a Microsoft customer and you're using any of the M365 security tool sets, for instance, such as identity protection. Identity protection is able to determine whether there's a user risk because their password has been found on the dark web. And it does that if you're using password hash sync from your on-prem environments and the user's passwords are being, the hashes are being synchronized up into Azure. They're able to do comparisons on those hashes with hashes found on the dark web, and you'll be alerted that a user has potentially been compromised, and it'll force them to change their password at next sign-up. Minimum length for passwords, 8 characters. Have that be the minimum. Doesn't necessarily mean that every user is going to just choose 8 characters, but 8 characters is a good floor as opposed to 14 or 16. Yes, those longer passwords are more secure, and they would be appropriate for IT to be using passwords of that length, especially for IT personnel that have access to privileged roles in the environment. They should be using a long password, a long complex password. But for users, allow 8 characters, allow the entire ASCII set, even emojis could be used as passwords as well. And that way you make it so that it's easy for them to remember, but with the addition of enforcing MFA on their identity, is going to make it very difficult for a computer or an advanced persistent threat that's out there to be able to compromise that account. And then also eliminate the character composition requirements, right? So drop the need for having special characters in the password, because as we saw before, if they're being phished or if it's a credential stuffing attack or some of these other attacks, the password really doesn't matter. And again, this is a repeat of what I mentioned before, but eliminate the mandatory resets and rotation. And one thing you can also do is to ban common passwords. So with Azure AD, if you're a cloud-only consumer of Azure AD already has its own built-in banned password, so you can't use a password like password123 or p@SSW0RD, those types of passwords. If you are a hybrid customer, which is probably the majority of you out there, then utilize the password protection functionality that you have as part of the either EMS E3 or M365 E3 or E5, where you can also enforce password or a banned password list even for on-premise passwords. You can come up with your own dictionary. It could be appropriate for your regions. For instance, in the Northeast, where I'm based out of, I've known customers that have password protection policies turned on, and they ban the use of words like Yankees or Rangers or Giants, the local sports teams, from being used in the passwords, or perhaps the name of the company for being used in the password. But it could be tailored to your region, to your environment, so that again you can enforce that users are not using easily guessable passwords. Few other recommendations is make sure you're educating your users. Have a comprehensive education program around not using their corporate identities and passwords for non-work related purposes. So the password that they use to log into their corporate email is not the same password that they should be using to log into their personal email or to their Facebook account. And again, it's somewhat difficult to enforce that, but at least if you have the education around it, there are going to be a good number of users that will comply with that guidance. Whenever you can, use an enterprise-grade password manager for those applications that are still going to need passwords or those shared sites. A passwordless environment, while it's great, and we hope to get there for everything, and the likes of Google and Apple and Microsoft are working very hard in the FIDO Alliance with FIDO2 and WebAuthn to make it so that a lot more sites are going to be accessible without a password, either using biometrics or security keys or apps, authenticator apps on the device. There are still going to be those cases where there's a site that there's still a password that's necessary. So instead of having users come up with those passwords, use a password manager. My personal preference is LastPass. I've been using LastPass for years. We are not a LastPass partner, so I'm saying this out of my own opinion, not because there's a potential monetary gain for us in that regard. This is just a personal preference. But I've been using LastPass, and it's great because with a password manager, of course, you're able to come up with very unique passwords for every single site in an enterprise environment. So LastPass, for instance, has an enterprise-grade solution where you can deploy that and have shared sites where departments or teams are going to be, need to have access to these credentials. But you can even obfuscate the credentials so they don't even see what the password is, and have an administrator rotate the passwords as necessary for those sites. But again, the users are not affected. It's a seamless experience for them because whenever they go to that site, they're able to log in with that complex password and never have to know what it is. If you are using Azure AD, for example, you want to enforce that registration. So make it so that when a user is onboarded for the first time into your environment, they've been provisioned with an account, have policy set up so that the first time that they use that account to access a cloud resource, they have to register for MFA. In an Azure AD environment too, now there's a converged experience. So if you're using self-service password reset, that security registration information is applied to both MFA and self-service password reset. So it's a really nice seamless experience for the user. But make sure that when they first use it, that they have to register for those services. Also, enable and use risk-based multi-factor authentication challenges. I mentioned this briefly before, but identity protection in Azure AD is one of those risk-based tools that can determine risk based on where the user is signing in from. So if it's a country where they have not accessed any resources before and it's the first time they come up, they can be challenged for stepped-up authentication for MFA at that point. And then encourage the use of PIN and biometrics for authentication. This speaks to, for instance, on Windows 10, being able to leverage Windows Hello for Business. I've seen one too many environments where Windows Hello for Business is not only not deployed, but it's actually being blocked. And administrators have blocked access to the biometric scanners on the devices, the fingerprint readers or Face ID, or they're not allowing PIN as opposed to password. These are things that you should be encouraging. These are efforts that will get you closer to a passwordless environment. A PIN, as an example, is better than a password because that PIN is kept local. It's on that TPM chip that's going to do the decryption of the credential, and basically the only thing that's being passed is a credential or cryptographic proof that the user has authenticated successfully. And that PIN cannot be used on any other device. So even if that PIN got compromised by an outside attacker, they're not able to use that PIN to access any resources. It has to be tied to that device. Same thing goes for Face ID, same thing goes for fingerprint readers. So definitely start taking advantage of a lot of these built-in capabilities on hardware that doesn't even have to be new. A lot of hardware that's 10 years old supports those capabilities. So as mentioned, the road to passwords is long, but you have to take incremental steps. Like I say, don't try to boil the ocean. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. There are 4 basic steps to password freedom that you can start moving towards. And the first is to develop a password replacement strategy. So if we're going to go to passwordless, obviously we need something that can replace it. I've mentioned Windows Hello for Business as one of those solutions on Windows 10. Of course, if you have other devices in your environment, Chromebooks, for instance, and tablets of various types, iOS and Android tablets, there's going to be different solutions for those. But for instance, with Google, Chromebooks could perhaps leverage security keys like YubiKeys for their authentication as opposed to a password. But specifically around Windows 10, again, since we are a Microsoft partner, that's where our strength lies. So we can speak with some authority on that. We recommend looking at deploying Windows 10, Windows Hello for Business in your environments, and if you're in a hybrid environment, doing a hybrid Azure AD join, so your devices are connected to Azure AD, because then you can also leverage that as an access control with your conditional access policies. Step 2 would be to reduce the user visible password surface area. And basically what this means is while you have Windows Hello for Business deployed, you're still going to be using passwords as in your environment, but try to reduce that user visible area where the user is very rarely, if ever, asked for a password when they're accessing applications. And this also calls for modernizing your application. So if you still have legacy applications on-prem, consider modernizing those, migrating those to the cloud whenever possible, taking advantage of, for instance, the Azure App Proxy to publish your applications into Azure AD so that you can take advantage of conditional access for authentication and Azure AD for authentication to those applications. But the goal here is to just make it so that whenever a user sees a password prompt, it is a rarity for them. It is something that's not the norm, and it will give them pause before they enter their credentials into a credential dialog box. Third step is to start transitioning into a passwordless environment. Again, so This is where that user visible password surface area has been eliminated or reduced greatly. And I'll go back a step and also mention that for your service accounts that may still be using passwords, and you may be using some privileged access management solutions to store and keep the passwords for those accounts secure. Remember too that if you're in a Windows environment, Windows Server environment, and you're at least using Windows Server 2012 R2, you do have the ability to use group managed service accounts. And I know that a lot of applications may not support group managed service account, but a lot of the main ones do. SQL Server does. If you're still using ADFS for Federation, for instance, ADFS can use group managed service accounts. And what's great about those accounts is that Active Directory essentially maintains the passwords. It's a very long, complex password that no one has to know, and Active Directory handles the rotation of those passwords. So that's another way to reduce that surface area of passwords. But here in step 3, you're in an environment where the user never types a password, they never change their password, and they may not even know what their password is. So imagine that scenario where now they get a phishing email that's asking them to enter their credentials, but they don't even know what those credentials are because they have not used their password in quite some time, because they've been using Windows Hello for Business and they have single sign-on turned on for all their enterprise applications, and they're never prompted for a password, but yet everything is kept secure. And then finally, step 4 is where you can eliminate passwords from the identity directory altogether. That is where passwords are not even being stored in Active Directory or your identity provider solution, where everything is either going through Windows Hello for Business or certificate-based authentication. And again, passwords are not even hashed in the environment. And this guidance, actually, there's a Microsoft a process for this. This is something that we're able to help customers do. So if there's any call to action and you're interested in taking a further look at this, please reach out to us, to your account rep here at Oxford Computer Group. We'd be happy to have that conversation with you. But that's the end of our presentation. If there are any questions, I'll check our question panel here. Feel free if you do have any question. There's one question regarding that Verizon study. So the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report, that one they just released a new one for 2019. So you can go out and just look for the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report. I believe the stat that's in my slide might be like 2 years old. The new one that I saw, I think the incident rate of passwords being the cause of a lot of the breaches is down a bit, but perhaps in the 60% range. But the stat still holds true that passwords continue to be a source of a lot of the breaches that we see out there. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you join us on our next webinar session next month. So keep an eye out in your email for information on that. Otherwise, have a great day.